Okay, hopefully you found some time to chat with someone and talk about what you think is going to happen at the end of this story. Remember where we left off? We left off with Humphrey having this plan. So he has this plan, and we're not quite sure what it is yet, but we do have a clue because it says The Trouble with Monsters is the title of the next chapter. Let's see what happens. It's a monster, Richie shouted. Run for your life, Art screamed. Help, Seth shrieked. They howled and yelled. They shouted and screeched. No matter how loud I screamed, I could never sound as loud as those boys. As I pawed the air and tried to look big, I heard footsteps running away from the tent. Help! Help! The shrieks moved toward Richie's house. The yard was quiet again. I relaxed and stopped acting like a monster. So the boys were afraid of some things too. I hoped the boys weren't too scared, but I was glad that my plan had worked. Then I heard footsteps coming toward my tent. Eek! I squeaked. I knew it was probably just Mr. Hopper, but I didn't want to be caught outside of my cage. My friends might find out about my secret lock that doesn't lock, and if they did, they might decide to fix it. Then I'd be stuck in my cage forever and ever. So I dashed to my cage and pulled the door closed. What's going on out here? Mr. Hopper asked. He poked his head in the tent flap and looked around. The flashlight was still on, and so was the music. My shadow was on the wall, but now it was my shadow inside the cage. Mr. Hopper laughed when he saw it. I think I see what happened, he said. He left and came back again with Heidi, Gale, Say, and Miranda. Are you sure it's safe out here? Heidi asked. I could hear those boys screaming from inside the house. Gale nodded. I saw them running across the yard. I'll show you what scared them, Mr. Hopper said. Humphrey cast a shadow on the wall of the tent. He took them around the outside of the tent. It looks huge, Miranda said. It looks like a lion in a cage, Say whispered. But it wouldn't scare me, Heidi said. Me either, Gale agreed. Silly boys. The girls came back into the tent. I'm not afraid to be out here, Heidi said. Girls aren't afraid of anything, Miranda added. Girls aren't afraid of anything, the girls all repeated. It's funny, but I don't remember leaving the flashlight on, Heidi said. Or the music. Say, Gale, and Miranda didn't remember either. I didn't squeak up and tell them I had turned it on. The girls stood between the flashlight and the side of the tent and made funny shadows, like pictures on the wall. Gale made a crocodile using her hands. I was just a little bit afraid when she snapped the crocodile's jaws. Miranda made a bunny rabbit with her hands. It had a tall, floppy ear. Heidi made a dog. She wiggled her fingers and his ears flopped. Then his mouth opened and shut. Woof, woof, she barked. That made Gale giggle. Miranda looked at me. It's your turn now, Humphrey. I got up on my tippy toes and raised my paws in the air, like a monster. The girls saw my shadow and laughed and laughed. I guess girls aren't afraid of anything after all. When it was time for the girls to go to sleep, Heidi's parents came out to the tent. Mrs. Hopper tucked the girls into their sleeping bags, and I settled down in my bedding. Now get some sleep, girls, Mrs. Hopper said as she left the tent. You too, Humphrey. Once we were alone, the tent was quiet, quiet, quiet. Outside the tent, things weren't so quiet. First, we heard something say, ooh, ooh. What animal says that? Gale sat up. What's that? She asked. It's an owl, Miranda answered. At least, I hope it's just an owl. Then we heard a fluttering sound, like wings. What's that? Heidi asked. Miranda sat up and looked around. It's the tent flap, she said. At least, I hope it's the tent flap. It was quiet again, but almost too quiet. I was feeling a bit nervous, so I hopped onto my wheel. Spinning always relaxes me. I forgot my wheel makes a loud whirring sound. I don't notice it in the classroom where there are other noises, but in the tent, it sounded unsqueakably loud. What's that? Gale asked in a frightened voice. I don't know, Miranda sounded even more frightened than Gale. It's just me, I squeaked. Listen to Humphrey, Say said. He must have just seen something. Heidi crawled out of her sleeping bag and stood up. That's it, she said. I'm sleeping in the house. Me too, Gail said. Me too, Miranda said. And me, Say softly added. Me too, I squeaked. The girls quickly rolled up their sleeping bags. They took their flashlights, the lantern, and my cage back into the house. As Say carried my cage across the yard, I could see that the tent in Richie's garden was dark. I was pretty sure the boys had also gone inside. And even though I didn't see any real creepy crawly creatures in the garden, besides the night crawlers, I was happy to sleep inside too. Heidi took me back to school on Monday morning. When Mrs. Brisbane saw us, she asked how the weekend had been. Great, Heidi answered. I had a camping night in the backyard with my friends. So did I, Richie said. Oh, Mrs. Brisbane replied. Were you scared to sleep outside? No, Heidi said. Girls aren't afraid of anything. Neither are boys, Richie added. They weren't exactly squeaking the truth, but I'm pretty sure they believed what they said. During class, Mrs. Brisbane asked, What's the opposite of frightened? Richie raised his hand and said, Fearless. Later that night, I showed Og the friendship bracelet on the cage. Then I told him all about our creepy crawly camping adventure. He splashed in his tank and said, Boing, 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 boing. The girls were scared, and the boys were scared, I told my froggy friend. I wasn't afraid, I said. At least not much. But I think that's all right for girls and boys, and even hamsters, to be a little bit afraid of creepy, crawly creatures, even when the scariest thing in the yard turned out to be me. Take a minute and gather your thoughts after that story. It's a good one. Have you ever felt scared, a little bit frightened? I know I have. Why don't you turn and talk and tell somebody a story about a time that you felt a little bit frightened?